Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello, thank you for joining us. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is eligible for one contact hour. Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing, also known as Sigma, is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. No one in control of the content today have any relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies. To receive contact hours for this NCPD session, participants are required to attend the webinar and then log into our learning management system to complete an evaluation form. Information on how to access this will be emailed to all attendees approximately 1 week after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available via the Sigma repository in approximately 1 week. Following the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. You'll see on your Zoom webinar control panel that you can send a message through the Q&A feature. This is where you can type in any question you'd like to pose to our presenters. Be sure to hit send so the message makes it to us. Please use the Q&A for questions and the chat feature to interact with other participants. We'd like to thank our speaker for sharing their expertise with us today. Of note, thoughts and views expressed are that of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect that of Sigma. This webinar is proudly sponsored by Liability and is the first webinar in the Creating Safety Nets for Your Nursing Practice webinar series. And our presenter today is Madison Edwards. Madison is a nursing professional with extensive experience in nursing leadership and regulation. Based in Oklahoma City, Madison has served as a director in both inpatient and ambulatory settings and as the director of nursing in a Joint Commission certified facility. With a background in surgery and perioperative care, Madison has led large interdisciplinary teams in a variety of healthcare settings, ensuring the highest standards of patient care. Additionally, she has contributed to the nursing profession as the Associate Director for Nursing Practice for a State Board of Nursing, demonstrating a commitment to quality and regulatory compliance. Madison has a passion for creating high reliability processes to ensure the safest patient care. We are so grateful to have you today, Madison, and we'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm coming to you from the Midwest here in the United States. Hopefully, if something I present isn't directly toward your jurisdiction, you can take a pearl of something that might apply to you. A lot of our state boards all kind of tie up through the NCSBN, even in countries that don't participate. They're still kind of the gold standard. So there's really good nuggets in there that I hope that help you out. So I'm thrilled for you to be a part of our first webinar today in our series, Your Invisible Shield. What does professional liability insurance do for you? As she said, this is the first of three coming your way. A lot of these topics that I handpicked for you are not only straight from my heart, but from years of experience in hospital administration, as a nursing board regulator, and then ultimately a risk manager. So I'm now the executive vice president of OmniSure Consulting Group, which is a clinical risk management group. I was lucky enough to stumble upon this picture of myself with my Sigma cord. This is pre-cloud, so it's actually a picture of a picture. It's one of the only photos I own. So anyway, just thought I'd date myself there a little bit, but a little about myself. I couldn't wait to get into practice, so I just immediately ran to the hospital setting, and she mentioned a little bit on my background. Um, so after I worked in the hospital for a really long time and became a director of nursing, I took a total 180 and went to work for the state board. And that just blew my mind, opened my eyes to not only how to protect my license, but all of the hundreds of nurses that entrusted me to protect their license too. So I found this awesome mentor at the board. She was the deputy director. She was there for 15 years and she really mentored me and showed me what regulation was. So then after that, I immediately turned around and went right back to the hospital. And I said, "You guys, we're looking at all of this the wrong way." So when I went back, I was over all of our surgery departments for our system. And so it was a tall order, but it allowed me to share that experience with the rest of our system. All right. So there we go. Today, we're going to cover the ins and outs of professional liability insurance. So, we're going to discuss the risks that you're exposed to in this line of work. We're going to debunk some common misconceptions about this kind of insurance. And then, lastly, we're going to get a big picture look at what malpractice insurance does for you. So, professional liability insurance, what exactly is it? Well, it goes by a couple names. So, it's known as malpractice insurance, it's known as errors and omissions, and it's a type of policy that protects professionals against claims of negligence or inadequate work. So, this kind of insurance is the exact same kind that a doctor carries and protects the event that they're sued for negligence, errors, or omissions in the delivery of their professional services. And a professional liability policy speaks to a ton of people with licenses, and they're all written nearly identically, which is so funny because we think ours is going to be just written for nurses, but really, the principles of this kind of insurance are the same no matter who you are, as long as you carry a license. So there are a myriad of professionals that should carry this kind of insurance, including nurses, doctors, attorneys, accountants, consultants, and architects. And for the most part, like I said, the policies look nearly identical. The main principle being that if you have a license to protect, the coverages are fairly universal. Just the same way that you can make an error and injure a patient, think about if an architect makes an error, all of the people that could potentially be injured or harmed in the event that that happens. So, your professional liability insurance covers legal defense, settlements or judgments against you, and other claims of professional negligence or failure to perform your professional duties. So, what it isn't. Malpractice is also written in a way where the policy reads exclusions. And that tells you, honestly, a lot more about the policy sometimes than what it does cover. But what a malpractice policy won't cover would be criminal acts and dishonesty. It generally is going to exclude coverage for any kind of dishonest or criminal acts committed by a nurse or a licensed person. It includes theft, fraud, or any other legal activities. And this is typically what would catch like drug diversion. Your policy would not cover you for drug diversion, likely. Alteration of medical records would void your policy. If a nurse goes back and alters the records in an attempt to cover up a mistake or for any other reason, malpractice insurance is likely not going to cover claims that arise from those actions or surround those actions. So if you go back to alter a record or make a late entry, you may be very well violating your policy language and find yourself without coverage when you need it. The key is if you need to edit a medical record, you need to follow the policy for your hospital or whoever employs you. They all have a medical records policy. So know it, love it, follow that, and that will be your guiding instructions if that need arises. Um, your policy isn't going to cover you for acts outside your scope of employment, your scope of licensure. So let's say if a nurse engages in something outside their duties of employment, such as unauthorized medical procedures or moonlighting without appropriate coverages, these actions are typically not going to be covered by standard malpractice. Um, and let's say if you, outside of work, say your friend has a kid and they fall, and you think, oh, well, I've seen this done before. I'm going to go ahead and just suture this kid up, and then something tragic actions happens. They get an infection, something terrible. We could go down all the horrible things that could happen. You may not be covered if this action is outside your scope. And that would put you in a little bit of an unsafe place as far as your insurance coverage goes. Substance abuse, your malpractice is not going to cover instances where you're found to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol on your job. And then sexual misconduct. Most policies do not cover allegations of sexual abuse or molestation. And as wild as this sounds, these claims are abundant in healthcare. I cannot reiterate that enough. We're going to touch on it again. And it's on the horizon that many school districts, nonprofits, community programs, or any program that works with kids or other vulnerable populations, they'll require their volunteers or employees to furnish their own personal limits of sexual abuse and molestation coverage because that is how rampant it is. I can't reiterate it enough. Even if the nurse didn't actually molest the patient, you have to protect yourself against these kind of allegations. So we've seen patients that have claimed sexual abuse or molestation if the nurse makes maybe a couple offhanded comments and then pats the patient on the shoulder through that thin patient gown. A patient could interpret that as suggested and feel as if it's inappropriate. And that report right there can place a nurse on suspension, sometimes even without pay, as the investigation's underway. So perception is everything, and everything is magnified when you feel vulnerable, and our patients feel incredibly vulnerable. So claims related to sexual misconduct, including harassment and abuse, are not going to be covered in most nursing malpractice insurance policies. And typically, this exclusion applies regardless of whether the misconduct involves a patient or another colleague. Now, I will say the pro liability policy does have sexual abuse and molestation coverage, which is very rare in this industry. So, what risks do nurses face exactly? Well, here's a list of the top ones that we see. Being associated with healthcare at all brings its own set of risks. It's a highly litigious industry, as we know. So great, in fact, that there is a whole industry dedicated to ensuring that patients are compensated from harm that occurs to them in the delivery of healthcare. So in 2016, there was a highly publicized, highly criticized, and hotly debated study that labeled medical errors as the third leading cause of death in the United States after heart disease and cancer. So, although the study has since been called into question, it really magnified some of the issues that we're having in healthcare, and its reach spanned continents and created a huge distrust in the delivery of care that's delivered, at least in the United States. As we know, plaintiffs' lawyers, which is someone who a patient would go get to represent them if they felt they were harmed, are in multitude. And anytime a patient is harmed in the delivery of care or has a perception that they were harmed, people and institutions get sued to compensate for those damages that occur. Often, medical professionals can be subpoenaed to provide deposition or testimony, even when they had absolutely nothing to do with the case. The people who investigate these cases and the attorneys cast an incredibly wide net to try and find any crack in the defense. So, for example, let's say you had a patient with a really long stay, like a 26-day stay in the hospital. Every single person that touched that patient is likely going to be questioned. And so, even if you provided nothing but the admission assessment of the very first shift, likely you would get called in for questioning and your care would be questioned. And as we know, documentation is crucial, and that admission assessment is the baseline to which the care for the rest of the stay is going to be compared. So, all nursing care that we deliver has risk, and even the best nurses' care can get called into question. And honestly, I've seen some of the best nurses I've known had to face depositions, and sometimes, unfortunately, it can just be the cost of doing business if you're a nurse. So let's talk about some of the truths and myths about employer coverage. This is always a hot topic on the nursing blogs because nurses are often advised, don't worry, we've got you. Your hospital is going to cover your malpractice insurance. And that's great. And they may. But 99.999% of those policies that they are referring to are actually a hospital policy in which they're protecting themselves and all of the work that occurs in that building, in that network, in that system. Your name is likely going to be found nowhere on this hospital policy. So there's a legal concept known as respondeat superior. And what that means is that if you're a business, an entity, or an employer, anything that happens underneath you, you are liable for. So that often is the reason that they say, we cover you. So that hospital policy is going to protect the hospital's interests, not the individual nurses. That attorney is going to prioritize the hospital's interests and needs over yours, even if they conflict with yours. And healthcare systems typically only cover malpractice claims, not other issues like board complaints. And their coverage of you is likely going to be limited to the duration of your employment with them. Your employer will not defend you in the event of a board complaint, as likely they're the ones that reported you. So that would kind of be a conflict of interest. They certainly wouldn't furnish you their own hospital attorney to do so. And if you are covered by your employer, you wouldn't get to either have your own or choose your own attorney. You're just going to have who's sitting there to represent the hospital. You aren't going to be in any way covered for work that you do outside the entity. So that could be camp nursing or volunteering or anything else that you do. Um, we have seen it happen that nurses can and are sued independently. So that means as a named defendant in a suit, we see that all the time. And many organizations are choosing to settle as opposed to fighting charges. A lot of times it's cheaper for them to come up with a mutually agreeable settlement for both them and the patient. And so even if you did nothing wrong, you don't want to be lumped in with a larger defendant. And if you have your own policy, your attorney is going to be there for you. So, professional liability insurance protects your personal assets that you've worked so hard for. And so, some people say, I don't need liability insurance because they have a perception that the attorneys will only go after people with the deep pockets, like the hospitals. And while most lawsuits are settled or dismissed, some ultimately go to trial. And so, if you are named in a suit and the jury finds in favor of the patient, the jury will determine a monetary reward or award, and whether you have insurance or not, you're going to be on the hook for that. So if it's within your policy limits, then you'll be 100% covered by your malpractice insurance policy. If you don't have coverage, then you will personally be ordered by a judge through a court order to pay that money to the patient or the family of the patient that's filing the claim. If you don't satisfy the court order, the courts can then make a motion to enforce that judgment in which your wages can be garnished, they can seize your home. And then to add insult to injury, that violation of not fulfilling a judgment can be viewed as professional misconduct and therefore get treated as disciplinary action by your licensing board. So it's just kind of one issue after another. And this leads to, of course, more legal problems and expenses that can affect your finances, your ability to work, and your license. So that's why having a professional liability insurance policy can really be a beautiful thing. So, a little bit about claims made versus occurrence policies. You might hear people talk about this if they're talking about their own policy. So, a claims made policy covers you if the incident and the claim both happen while the policy is active. So, if you stop paying for this insurance, you lose coverage for any incidences that haven't been claimed yet. So to keep coverage from past incidents, Paul, and these after the policy ends, you would need to buy a tail to extend your coverage, and these are super pricey. They're often 100% to 500% of your regular premium, and they need to normally be paid in a lump sum after your policy ends. What an occurrence policy is, um, it's a little bit more straightforward and often preferred because it covers anything that happens while the policy was acted active, even if the claim is made years later. So once you purchase it, you're covered for events during that time, regardless of when the claim is filed. And this type of policy tends to be more expensive upfront, but it can provide long term peace of mind so that you don't need additional coverage like tail coverage. So, um, occurrence policies aren't available everywhere. So you do need to shop around. Pro liability is one. So if you're a nurse and you retire, most people end their policy then. And so that way, if anybody comes out and says, hey, this harm happened 2 years ago, I'm within the statute of limitations, your policy is going to cover you. So a little bit about other protections that this is going to offer for you. Here's kind of a list of the basics. So all types of claims or coverages have policy limits. So for everything that your policy lists that it will cover, so here's some really good ones. So legal representation, HIPAA coverage if you have a privacy error and you get in trouble, licensing board reimbursement, if you get depositioned or deposed, wage and expense losses if you are required to be in court from something resulting from a claim, first aid reimbursement, damages, first party assault. Each of those will have a coverage limit. For example, your HIPAA insurance might carry a coverage limit of $25,000, which in most cases is enough to cover that claim. There are some additional coverages that you can have in addition to your policy. So if you're a nurse and you work with clinical groups and you're doing some education or consulting, you can add that to your policy. If you speak at seminars or provide expert testimony, any of those other things would fall under there. You can add general liability, which would protect you in physical risks or bodily injury to yourself or others. And then there are even cyber policies that nurses can add. So you can really create a policy that is completely tailored to you. So here's something a lot of people don't know. If you have a license, you will be regulated, whether or not that function that you're performing is a nursing function. So here's an example that I heard all the time at the Board of Nursing. I answered the phone for any person calling with a practice question. So this is what I got several times, which means it's happening a lot. There's a statistic that says anytime someone has a question, 26 times that person also had the same question. So that's why this is important. So let's talk about a nurse who on the side wants to work as an esthetician. In this state, an esthetician or an unlicensed person can provide a microneedling facial. Let's say a nurse wants to do this, if the unlicensed person does it and they harm a patient, they can get tried civilly. However, if a nurse does it, even though her nursing license isn't required, and she accidentally overestimates the settings and gives a treatment that gives the patient a full thickness skin burn, this person who's doing the same procedure, because she is licensed, has so much more on the line. So not only can she be sued civilly, just like the lay person doing it, but she can also have her license disciplined or even revoked. So different punishment. There's a different expectation for nurses. So as long as you have a license, it's going to be regulated. And even though it's extremely unlikely, as we saw in the case of Renan Devat, a nurse can even be tried criminally. So one more reason to protect yourself with your policy. So as many of us are excited to get to work and pay off our student debt, we have to remember there's so much more on the line when it comes to protecting our professional licenses. Now, I'm of the belief that you don't have to be afraid of something that you know. And so in this case, you're taking all the steps that you need to educate yourself and learn so that you don't find yourself in the situation that some other providers have found themselves in. And according to the National Provider Data Bank, in recent years, nursing professionals are on average 60 times more likely to be involved in an adverse licensing action than a malpractice payment. And often, like I said earlier, your employer is the one who reports a nurse to the board. And in this case, like we said, they would not even be able to defend you. And your malpractice policy would be your saving grace. So I'm not sure if how many of you know this, but most states and jurisdictions have a clause written into the Nursing Practice Act that require you to report other licensed nurses who violate the Practice Act. And so that's a large reason why we see so much employer reporting is if they see a nurse violate the act and something happens, they're worried that they're going to come back to the employer and say, well, we don't have any report of this and you knew about it because you disciplined the nurse. And so often then they'll go to the board and report it. So that's why we see that happen so much. And unlike civil and criminal suits that have statutes of limitations, many states don't have time limits for filing a board complaint. So, in most states, for an adult, for an injury that happens to an adult, they have about 2 years, depending on the jurisdiction, to file a lawsuit. It's much different for minors, and it looks much different in every state and every jurisdiction for minors. But for a board complaint, there's no statute. I can file a board complaint on a nurse that I feel like harmed me 15 years ago. And so that's another really liability that is kind of nuanced in these situations too. And that being said, I'd like to shamelessly plug our next two webinars that are going to talk a lot more about licensing boards. So I think one of the things that was so shocking to me was how affordable professional liability policies are. A pro liability policy for a nurse averages around $10 a month. So that's minimal to what you could spend defending yourself against a board complaint or a malpractice suit. And truly, I have to shamelessly admit, I think I spend more than $10 a month on coffee, especially working in a hospital. I know I did. So, for example, defending yourself against even an uncomplicated or unfounded allegation to the Board of Nursing can cost you between $2,000 and $10,000 to have an attorney for that. Representation for a deposition can cost you between $500 and $3,000. And some policies even offer benefits to you that might help you sleep better at night. So here's a horror story. This is an example of a completely unfounded board complaint that was against a seasoned nurse of 30 years. So there was a complaint filed against her license, it had allegations of neglect and poor judgment. I think it was from a patient. So initially she was totally overwhelmed. And she didn't think that she needed an attorney though, because she was thinking to herself, oh, well, I didn't do it. They're unfounded allegations. So she just responded to the nursing board herself, thinking there's going to be a swift resolution to this. However, months passed and she had no reply. And she was eventually informed that although she had complied with all the requests of the board and gave them a response, they would continue to proceed with disciplinary action. So she was shocked. She finally engaged an attorney who took over communications with the board. They spoke for her. And then after and during 9 months of stress and uncertainty, she received formal charges, but had evidence to refute each one. And then during the settlement hearing, she presented her case to the board, highlighted her exemplary employment record. She'd had no discipline from her employer ever before, and she was able to refute the unfounded nature of the claims. Ultimately, the charges were dropped. However, that experience was terrible, lasted 9 months, like I said, and kind of left her disillusioned with everything that had happened to her. And this is just not an experience that you want to face alone. Having an attorney on your side, I'll tell you right now, the nursing boards approach those situations with nurses who have attorneys completely different than with nurses who don't. So this is never something that you want to go alone. Perhaps one of the best parts about your malpractice insurance policy is the availability of risk management resources. So, shameless plug, this is what I do all day, and I truly love it. I help people just like you navigate even the stickiest of situations. The risk management that you receive from an insurance provider is always going to be top notch. Why, you ask? And that's because if we can help policyholders be low risk insureds and avoid claims, then the insurance companies can keep the policy rates low for everyone else and offer more insurance policies. And so everyone wins when risk managers are there to support the caregivers. And lastly, you'll have a claims team that if a qualifying event occurs, they'll step in and navigate the situation in a way that protects you. These teams are stacked with attorneys and other experts and risk managers to get you out of the situation as quickly and painlessly as possible. And honestly, any of the events that we've described today, they all take time. And with an insurance company at your back, they'll get the issue resolved quickly so you can get on to work, move back on with your life, and not have something that takes months and months and months that an insurance company could resolve for you in a couple weeks. So here's an example of what people call us with on our helpline. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And these are the hottest spots that people call with. I can easily say that. So I get questions about abandonment a lot, and employment issues. That's what our next segment's going to be on. We talk a lot about documentation. Nurses call me to tell me about their side hustle, ask me for advice on that. Event management, if something happens, like if something happens at work and a patient dies, they'll call me afterwards. We'll debrief. Sexual abuse allegations, I get calls on that all the time, especially from advanced practice providers. I get lots of calls from advanced practice providers, school nurses, and then my catch-all is always just spidey sense. I have nurses that will call me after a shift and say, "Gosh, I just got off a really long shift in the ER. Something just doesn't feel right." And so we'll talk through a lot of those situations and figure out if there's something there. And I always say, as a nurse, trust your gut. There's a reason that we became nurses, and typically, if a nurse feels like something is wrong, something is wrong. So there's risk exposure beyond employment, like we talked about earlier, volunteer work, giving friends or neighbors advice. People always say, "Oh, you're a nurse. I'd love to ask you about X, Y, or Z." There's liability in us doing that. Checking a blood pressure or glucose at a health fair, working at a summer camp, church, or other setting. And I think the undertone of all of this, and that what a lot of my experience has given me, is if you have a license that is regulated, you're exposed to risk. So I wanted to kind of plug our next installments here. So our next um, webinar is going to be November 5th, Empowered Nursing. We're going to talk about staffing, we're going to talk about delegation and professional integrity. And then on the 12th, we're going to talk about the board. What is it? Overall, demystifying it, what it is. And like I said, you never have to be afraid of something that you know. And if the more we can understand about legislation, statute, and code, the less we have to be afraid in our nursing practice. So knowledge is power, and I've made it my personal mission to bring it to you. And then lastly, I want to introduce Erin. She is the senior relationship member at AMBA. So she is the connection between pro liability and Sigma. I put her picture there. She's awesome. She is a nurse's friend for sure. If I had to name one, you can get a quote by scanning that QR code there, and then you can also contact Pro Liability, who sponsored me to come chat with you today, at the contact there on the screen. And I think maybe we might have a few questions, maybe not.
Thank you so much, Madison, for all of this great information. We're going to stay on this slide for a little bit while we wait for some questions to come in, but I do have one. Could you expound on the poor judgment complaint and who deems what is poor judgment of a nurse?
Sure. Are you talking about the 30-year nurse who got the board complaint?
Yes, uh-huh.
Okay, so this is what anyone says it is. So anyone who feels like they received substandard care can make a board complaint. And so The board will then go through the investigative process to determine if that happened. And something that I'm sure that you've all heard before, it's echoed in practice acts across the world, but they will compare you to the acts of a reasonable and prudent nurse. If they were in that same situation with the same licensure, knowledge, and preparation, would they have done the same thing? And so that's kind of how they land on um, what they decide to do with that nurse, but that's what they compare her to as the standard of care. And for the standard of care, you should always go back to your professional organization because that's what any plaintiff's attorney is going to say that you do. So, for example, if you work in chemo, they're going to compare you to Chemo Nurses Society, the Infusion Nurses Society, and what those standards say to do.
Perfect. That is a great answer. Thank you so much. We do have a participant that says they do have liability insurance. How are the policies from one company transition to another, and how does that affect their protection? Does it remain intact?
Sure. So, your professional liability policy is likely not employer specific. That said, they will likely execute the policy in good faith, which means they are going to insure you to what you said that you do. So when you applied, did you list all of the things that you do? Did you list your entire scope of practice and your specialty? Did you say that you worked in family care, but really you worked in labor and delivery, which is a much more highly litigated, more litigious area of nursing? Did you list your employer? Did you list that you're also covered by your employer? All of those things. So typically, that policy won't be specific to where you are. It's just going to follow you as long as you're working under the scope of practice of your licensure. That's typically how they're written. That said, all policy language is a little bit different. Some policies are going to cover you no matter where you work afterwards. So let's say you work at a pediatric hospital on the weekends, you work in an adult ER during the week, that depending on how it's written, they'll likely cover you wherever you are to the scope of your practices. Some will say, we don't cover any moonlighting whatsoever. We're going to cover your main job and that's it. So it just depends on the policy language. That is a great question to ask when you're shopping for policies.
Thank you so much. We have another question for you, Madison. Uh, Oftentimes, nurses are told to not inform your employer of personal liability coverage because the organization will list you as a defendant as well. Is this true?
Um, I think that that is definitely a mystery. I do know a lot of people choose to keep the fact that they have a liability policy to themselves. A lot of people are afraid that if they publicize that, they'll think, oh my gosh, they're going to see that I have this coverage. However, I can say that the coverage that an individual would carry, even a physician, let's say that he has, a $1 million policy for occurrence, that hospital is going to have a $15 million policy per occurrence. So when a judgment um, is set by a judge, they'll divide that among the parties proportionately. So maybe they'll say, okay, well, the hospital is 95% liable, the nurse was only 5% liable, something like that. So likely, I don't think that that would make you put a bigger target on your back because a nurse isn't by any stretch of the imagination the deep pockets that the plaintiff's attorneys are looking for. Some things that hospitals don't like to have to do is to deal with a whole bunch of other attorneys when they're working on a case. They want to be able to have their hospital attorneys and them decide how everything goes. And sometimes somebody having their own attorney, them saying, well, Erin here, she wasn't really a part of this. So we're going to have work to have her pulled out of the defendant list so they can do things that kind of remove you from that situation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for elaborating on that. And transitioning a bit to nursing school. Nursing school teaches us to never give updates to family members over the phone because we can't be 100% sure of who is on the other end of the line. But in reality, it is often done. How often are HIPAA violation complaints in your experience? Do you have anything to share related to that?
Absolutely. So in these situations, your employer should have a policy that helps you decide who you get to speak to on the phone. Especially in cases where if the patient comes in and they're awake, likely there'll be a discussion on an ROI or release of information, and that's who can we talk to? Who in the room with you is someone who is a shared decision maker or a trusted individual that you allow us to have medical conversations with? Some people will come in and say, you can talk to anybody. Anybody who's in here can know about me and I don't care, and kind of laid back. But some people also will say, you can talk to this one person. This is especially true if somebody has an advanced directive, they might designate someone to do that. So either way, it can be either way. But likely your facility will have a policy.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you mostly is it is the best practice for the nurse to follow the policies of their organization, right?
100%. Yes, when in doubt. And sometimes they'll to have a list of people who we've talked to this person. She's come up here. We validated that she's a family member. She's okay to talk to.
And let's talk a little bit about side hustles. So, you know that many nurses don't just have one job, but sometimes can have two or three. What is the concern there when it comes to liability and different complaints to the board or a malpractice complaint?
Great question. So anybody that you're a contractor for, they likely will have some legal responsibility to you, but no real actual responsibility, and they typically won't cover you at all. So if you are doing something on the side, um, likely they aren't going to cover you. They would under the legal responsibility, that respondeat superior concept that we talked about, but um, likely they won't be you're not going to be under a policy of theirs. Those are all things where you'd want to have your own policies, or if you're doing something on your own altogether and you are the entity, you might need to look at, and you would definitely want to consult an attorney for this, but having your own LLC and covering yourself as an entity or PLLC or however they recommend that you structured it. And that's a case that you would definitely need your own if you're going to provide some sort of private nursing, anything like that. You're going to want to make sure that you have your own coverage.
And it looks like we are out of questions. So, Madison, do you have any parting words before I close us out today?
I don't think so. I appreciate everyone for joining us, and I hope that you can catch us on the next two sessions.
Wonderful. I want to thank you so much for presenting all of this great information today. Sigma is thankful that you took the time to share with our audience, and we definitely forward to hearing more from you in the future. We hope that you as attendees enjoyed this webinar. We have updated our process, so webinar attendees can now access our learning management system to complete the evaluation and obtain your certificate right away as the webinar concludes. Chris, if we could go to the last slide, please. Please note that you won't be able to click on the link on this slide, but we have shared it in the chat feature many times. So please feel free to use the link to access your nursing continuing professional development certificate after completing the evaluation. If you don't have time to do it today, don't worry because you will still receive the email with the link to complete the evaluation. Thank you all, and we invite you to join us for the remaining 2 webinars in this series, Creating Safety Nets for Your Nursing Practice. Protect your patients, protect yourself. Have a wonderful day.